Hey, what's up guys? Sir Emanon here, and welcome to another deck profile on the channel today. So this time it's going to be for Mekk-Knight Orcust for January 2021. And it's pretty interesting to already say 2021, even though the year hasn't officially ended yet. But I just want to, have this sort of active for the next format, which will continue into next year, obviously. But this is the culmination and sort of the findings and results of my Road to 1000 Duel Rating series. If you guys are not familiar, basically with that series, I made changes to where each new week I will explore a different deck and then play a series of matches all throughout that week. And then finally, I'll show you guys the finalized build here on Saturdays based on the evolution of my progress and what I found through testing. So it'll be more of sort of an active or interactive series. So if you guys do want to check those games out, if you want to see the deck in action, how it works, and things of that nature, definitely be sure to check out that playlist. I'll leave a link up in the top right corner of the screen in the cards, so you guys can go ahead and just get caught up if you would like to do that. But yeah, this is, as per usual, going to be a live deck building session where I'll start out with an empty template and then sort of move through each individual choice so that you guys can kind of understand the mindset. And additionally, if you guys do enjoy this style of video and this sort of in-depth content, definitely do leave a like in the video. It helps me out a lot. And if you're new here, consider subscribing for more of this similar style of video. But without further ado, let's just go ahead and get into the sort of theory before we get started here. So just some general notes. This is a very atypical build from the norm of what you're used to seeing. At its core, this is fundamentally going to be a control-oriented build, which is a very sharp departure from traditionally what Orcust is known for, right? You're used to things like Mermaid comboing off, or just the Striker Orcust build that was predominant in 2019, things of that nature, right? But this is not really any of that. It's going to be focused on sort of advantage generation, making favorable trades, and out-resourcing your opponent. And that is the essence of what a control deck is. The cool thing about Orcust is that it is a small enough and a contained enough engine to where you can ultimately just sort of be very flexible in how you build, which is something I'll talk about a bit later. But this has also the Mekk-Knight engine, which allows you to just continually accrue advantage turn after turn with Mekk-Knight Purple coming back, which fits very well into the Orcust package, of course. And this is, I think, a build, if nothing else, that showcases more of what the recursion of Orcust is capable of doing, right? Because other builds, they tend to be a bit more aggressive in that they try and close out the game quickly after they get their board established. But this build really just tries to loop resources over and over and over to overwhelm your opponent. And that works very well just because of the nature of the Orcust cards, of course. And just their recursive nature allows you to really overtake a lot of the maybe less grindy builds or decks in the format. So that is kind of just the general sort of synopsis of the deck. Next, I kind of want to talk about its strengths. So first, it has a very, very easy time getting its setup and its game plan kind of going, right? So the engine is very contained, like I mentioned. All you really need is a normal summon starter to resolve, and you basically have all that you ever really need to. You don't have to try and end on a crazy end board because that's not what you're really going for. You're trying to just set up to where you're going to be good for future turns, and then you'll have your non-engine defensive traps or hand traps to be able to back you up along the way. So you don't really need that much resource investment, which allows you to play very safely under very punishing circumstances. Things like Nibiru come to mind specifically, and that is why this build allows you to just sort of play a little bit under the radar and it'll catch your opponents off guard because they'll also be expecting you to be playing more aggressively than what people are prepared for, given that you're on Orcust, right? The second thing is that you're able to make very favorable one-for-one trades. I mentioned purple earlier in that it has a resource loop, being that obviously it's going to tag itself out every single turn for an extra Mekk-Knight resource, most of the time being Girsu, but that allows you to just continually get free +1s and allow you to get follow-up every single time. So even if you do get hand-trapped on your normal summon, as long as you can get that resource loop going, then you're good to go. And when you do get your normal summon established, you have the Orcust cards that allow you to force things very easily. Obviously, Jingirsu and Longirsu help out in that regard. But also, you have Crescendo, which is both a disruption and a follow-up, which is something that not many decks have access to. So that combined with some of the best disruption tools in the format that you can play make for a very, very favorable sort of advantage generation engine. The third thing is that it is very adaptable and flexible. So unlike a maybe more combo-oriented build, you're not really going to be able to change a whole ton in between formats if you're primarily just trying to combo off, right? Because a lot of your space in your main deck has to be devoted to sort of engine cards. So what this means is that with this build, because your engine is only about 20 or so spots, you can devote the other half of your deck to just whatever the meta calls for, which is really cool. You can kind of look at the meta game, see what you're trying to prepare for, and then build your deck accordingly, which is always nice to see. And then finally, which is my favorite thing, it plays very, very few garnets. And you guys know that I'm a big advocate for trying to play consistent builds whenever possible. And that is kind of the inspiration of why I went with Rocket Orcust last format. And that deck is definitely still viable this format. I just wanted to make a bit of a diversion towards a more control style build because that's where the format has seemed to shift for the most part. But this build kind of doubles down on that whole sort of idea of not playing that many garnets because you're really just playing the Orcust package that is necessary and not anything else that is an engine requirement. So that allows you to really just play everything that is going to be super impactful and cut out a lot of the fat. So next, I want to talk about, of course, some of the weaknesses because, got to talk about some of those as well, to be fair. So first, I think that this particular format is a little bit awkward for this deck because of the specific cards that are being played in a lot of people's decks to combat things like Virtual World and Drytron specifically, and Eldritch as well. So those are the most popular decks right now. And the cards that people are main decking, stuff like Ghost Spell and Skullmeister, and even DD Crow, they all hurt this deck as well. So just because of the way that this format has shifted, it tends to be a lot of graveyard hate, which Orcust obviously is not a fan of. And people are playing Lancia a lot as well in the side deck, so you'll be able to, or you'll be struggling against that post sideboard. So that's something to kind of consider. The next is that this deck, just by design, plays fewer extenders than other builds, which isn't a bad thing given the fact that that's kind of this deck's identity, is that you really just want to have starters and just play off of that. But what that means is that you'll have a little bit of a tougher time playing through maybe single point disruptions if you're playing like particular control mirror. You might have some issues getting your engine started, whereas maybe other control decks require things that are less vulnerable. Just off the top of my head, you can think of maybe something like a Sky Striker, which generally doesn't have its play engine as far as like the striker monsters themselves are concerned, be vulnerable to like Ash or Imperm or things like that. Whereas this deck does kind of have those choke points. So that's something to think about as well. And then finally, this deck, this is more of a deck building kind of paradox just in general for all control decks, really, this format. But the way that you build your deck is a little bit awkward given the fact that there's so much variation right now. So you might build entirely for one side of the spectrum and then just completely ignore the other, at least in the main deck, and then be ill prepared to face those decks in game one. So that's something that you kind of have to assess when you're deck building. Do you really want to prepare and make a strong meta call if you are in like maybe a larger tournament setting like an LCS, or would you rather sort of have a more well-rounded approach, which for the most part is what I would favor on something like a Dueling Book Ladder. But that is your choice to make. You can eliminate this weakness entirely if you try and just have a well-rounded build. And I'm not saying that it's impossible to cover for all of these areas, but just do keep in mind that sometimes like it's very, very difficult to have just favorable matchups against every deck. Otherwise, this would just be the best deck, right? So that's something to think about as well. But without further ado, let's just go ahead and now talk about the build for a bit as far as the individual card choices. So this is the bulk of what most people would come here for. So first off, we gotta talk about the Orcust package, of course. So the first is going to be, of course, 3 copies of Yugioh, the Orcust Mekk-Knight. This is an auto include. Given the fact that we still have 3 of this card, the OCG actually has this card at a 1, which is pretty interesting. But yeah, this is obviously the best normal summon. It gives you access to your plays. It allows you to have something that's in engine by name. And of course, the fact that it's a Mekk-Knight too allows you to integrate it with the Mekk-Knight engine as well, which is really, really nice to have. And this, of course, is pretty self-explanatory. I don't think anyone would really contest this. The next is kind of more starters. So this is a build that actually wants to see multiple normal summons as opposed to 0. Some builds would rather have like just pure extenders, but like I mentioned, this deck doesn't really have a ton of extension. So you'd rather just have an abundance of just strong normal summons that you can get access to your plays as quickly as possible. So we're going to be playing actually 3 copies of Scrap Recycler as well. Now we're not playing Scrap Golem because again, the point of this build isn't to combo off and to like try and make a high ceiling play. And Golem introduces more bricks as well as the Rosenix. But having Scrap Recycler by itself just allows you to have another sort of like normal summon that allows you to accomplish many of the same things that Gyusu would. Obviously, Gyusu is better by virtue of what it is and the fact that it produces tokens as well. But nonetheless, Scrap Recycler is a very, very powerful starter. And just to kind of elaborate a little bit more on the point of wanting to see duplicates rather than none, oftentimes if you are planning on trying to go for this control style of build, you have to kind of assume that your opponent will have interruptions for what you're doing. Of course, that's just the way that a Yu-Gi-Oh works. And so if you're normal summoning a Gyusu and it gets stopped and you're forced to pass, you definitely want to have contingencies in some regard. You don't want to be sitting on that normal summon and then passing but not have a follow-up. That's kind of the pitfall of Orcust builds that don't prepare for this adequately, is that maybe you're running like a combo-oriented build, like maybe you're running the full scrap package, for example, and you normal the recycler and you don't have the extender. If you have to pass and you don't have another like backup normal summoner, backup play, then that's kind of one of the areas where Orcust can struggle. But if you can account for this by just playing more normal summons, sure, you might have less, potential non-engine defensive cards in your hand. Like this might take up a spot. Like if you open Gyusu plus Recycler, maybe the Recycler could have been, another trap card, for example, to help push past what your opponent is doing, or rather to help prevent what your opponent's doing. But in the event that you do get stopped on your Gyusu, for example, you want to have that backup so that you can just keep playing next turn and just try again. And because the plays are so low resource investment, you don't really mind having those duplicate names in your hand. In that sort of similar mindset, we are playing the one copy of Mekk-Knight. This is one that I think is, very, very similar to Scrap Recycler. I don't think there's really anything that you would send off Mekk-Knight that Recycler can't already send. So we're really just playing for the same name, essentially, right? So this is just falling in that same line of thinking. And then finally for the starter, and one that you can argue is an extender, is going to be 3 copies of World Legacy's Memory. So if I can find it, that is. So Memory is the quick play that allows you to special a Mekk-Knight from your hand or deck in defense position, but it returns itself to the hand at the end phase, and then it locks you into special summoning Mekk-Knights for the remainder of that turn after it resolves. So this allows you to get access to your Mekk-Knights, which is going to be 2 copies of purple and 1 copy of blue, or to your Gyusu itself at like certain instances where that does come up. So what this allows you to do is go for that aforementioned resource loop that I kept mentioning, which is basically if you can stick a purple on your field, you get free advantage every single turn, which is really nice in a control style of deck where advantage means everything. So the majority of the time you are going to try and get your purple from your deck, which allows you to search Gyusu, of course, and that is pretty self-explanatory. Blue is in here due to the fact that sometimes you just want extra link fodder. This helps out with that. It also lets you sort of just kind of have more advantage to kind of cycle through, because purple searching for blue then searching for Gyusu also can amount to a lot if you're going second, for example. So just having the extra flexibility is nice, and just more names to be able to search off your purple is ultimately good, just contributing more to just advantage generation, and that's the whole point of the Mekk-Knights. And then finally, for a starter card is a copy of Foolish Burial. This pretty much doesn't need any explanation, pretty self-explanatory. Next, we can go to the remainder of the Orcust package, which is all you can really technically count in terms of extenders. We're not playing anything like Dangers or things of that nature, because it really is just reliant on normal summon resolving. You have a very minimal low resource investment play, that being Galatea Crescendo, which we'll talk about, and then you can just kind of go from there and outgrind your opponent. So these are technically extenders, but I mean, they're only off the back of your normal summons the majority of the time. So we have 2 copies of Orcust Nightmare. And then, so I started off with this ratio. I started off with 2 Symbol and then a copy of World Wand. And this was my ratio here. And then I guess we can throw in Gizmic, because that is essentially part of your engine, right? Gizmic or Rochi, that is. So this was what I had to start off with. And I was thinking, okay, this is like very similar to what I was doing for Rocket Orcust, where with Rocket Orcust, I was playing 3 Nightmare. And then in this build, I surmised that because we're not playing a lot of discard outlets and we're not trying to combo off as heavily, this becomes more of a dead draw. So you naturally wouldn't want to max out in this. But for the rest of the engine, I have pretty much the exact same ratios as I did in that build. And this is what I was running with for quite a bit until I ran into some issues later in those episodes. If you recall to episode 3 specifically is where I realized that having just 1 copy of World Wand was not nearly enough. This is a card that I feel is just the most bricky out of the entire Orcust lineup, And unfortunately, that really can't be fixed by a lot of avenues. But the only one that really works without introducing a lot of other not very good cards to play is just playing a second copy of Wand, which is unfortunate because yes, this card it means that you'll draw this card more often, which you don't want to do in the first place. But that being said, if you in the event that you do draw it, because if you play only one, you're gonna still draw it one every 8 games statistically, right? So if you play two of it, yes, you'll be drawing it more often, around 22% of the time, but it makes it so that those cases where you do draw it with a normal summon, you can at least still have a little bit more flexibility in what your hand is trying to accomplish. So that's why that this can still end up working out if you like are able to send Nightmare, then send the second copy of Wand, summon the first from hand, and then you're able to have an extra body on the board that you might not have had previously. This is one of the few ways that you can get extenders. Harkening back to the point where this deck doesn't really have a lot of extenders to begin with, this can help out in those scenarios. And if you again just watch that match against the Zodiac Eldritch, there were times I was just really hurting for the second copy. So that's why through testing, that's how you kind of figure these things out. Is that like intuitively I didn't want to play multiple of this, but it made more sense as I was kind of deck building. And kind of I guess something to talk about here. This is maybe sort of adjacent to it, but we could talk about actually Dark Grepher for a little bit. So this is like another potential normal summon that you could play, just because it falls in line with like Armageddon Knight, and Scrap Recycler is just a way too foolish a name. And then you could play Rhoda to make it like 9 waste as a normal summon, which is pretty decent. The thing is that like you're not intending on drawing these. It's just you have to have contingencies in the event that you do. And this isn't as much a contingency as it is just kind of a way to get more value in those cases. Like this second copy of World Wand, for example, and the next card that we'll mention briefly in a second here are cards that allow you to actually, just make more favorable plays when the unfavorable outcome happens, which is, drawing this card to begin with. But like having another card that you have to hard draw in tandem with that is not necessarily the most reliable strategy. So I figured that because obviously you're going to be sending the wand and not like drawing it, that makes it like much more defensible to play, because that's going to be just a variation on your normal combo string without having to introduce very specific cards to make use out of particular circumstances, if that makes sense. So the basic condensed reasoning is that like why you would play the second World Wand over something like the Grepher is that this is something that you can access already with what your deck is trying to accomplish, that being your normal summons eventually getting to this, and then getting this into grave, and then summoning the second copy out of your hand. Whereas this, you just have to hard draw it alongside with what you don't want to happen in the first place, which isn't really the greatest thing, especially when in other cases it really just is a minus. And then kind of thinking about that, about like trying to minimize bricks, I end up realizing that a symbol is actually kind of a brick as well, because thinking about it, it really doesn't accomplish anything. And you already play a plentiful amount of normal summons. 7 is quite a bit. So a lot of the times you will be able to have access to one of these 7, or at the very least, memory or purple to get you access to Gyrusu. So there's no shortage of normal summons. So like this being normal summoned is not what you want to have. And you only really need 1 for continual resource looping. The only thing that really comes up is Gizmek potentially banishing it, but if you manage your resources correctly, that shouldn't be a problem. So I ended up cutting the second copy of Symbol, and actually I introduced a new name into the lineup, which is Orcust Brass Bombard. Some people are playing this, but this isn't something that I was normally playing for a while. But it kind of makes more sense because, again, this deck doesn't typically tend to play that many extenders, so any opportunity you can get to sort of play out your hand past various disruptions while still keeping the engine very contained and condensed is a very, very good thing to achieve. So this allows you to be more flexible. It fulfills obviously a different niche from Symbol itself, but by playing one-on-one, you can adapt to more different situations. And obviously these aren't things you're trying to open anyways, but this is much better to open in a lot of cases than like hard drawing the Symbol, just because in very niche scenarios this can help you get like a nightmare out of your hand. Obviously, again, we're not planning for scenarios like this because that's kind of the reason why we're not playing Grepher, but it's nice that we have that added benefit where we can still use this as another contingency similar to the second copy of World Wand, where if we do draw something like a nightmare, we can just go for our normal game plan but make a deviation in sending the Bombard and then just getting value that way. So these changes, the World Wand, the second copy, and the Brass Bombard are just ways to mitigate the natural downsides of playing some of the bricks that Orcust requires. And then finally, we have the Orcust Spell and Trap lineup. So we have Crescendo, which is the best one. This is the one you always want to be going for because, again, this is a control-oriented build. And even though this by itself represents less disruption than something like, say, IP, Babbled, and Girsu, it requires fewer resources. You don't have to open specifically Girsu. Like this works if you, Crescendo works if you just open like a Recycler or Armageddon Knight, for example. And the added benefit, the most important, is that it represents follow-ups. So the thing with IP Dingirsu is that once you go through your normal line, you'll have your Nightmare and your Symbol banished, and it won't be recycled back into your deck via Galatea. So after you go through all of that, you actually need another Orcust somehow to keep going. And I did mention that, of course, if you draw duplicate normal summons or have your Mekk-Knight engine going, then that's totally fine. But there are cases where that doesn't happen. And one of the best ways to kind of solve for that is just by having Crescendo to allow you to kind of keep going. But this is just a very strong, powerful disruption tool that's accessible, and it helps facilitate the control aspects of this deck very, very nicely. Now, the other spell of Trap is actually kind of debatable, and I'll talk about this. So I was on Babel, and I still am on Babel, but I want to make a very heavy asterisk here that this card actually is cuttable. And it sounds crazy, right? Because conventional Orcust wisdom will tell you that this is how you get all your disruption, and you can be a lot more aggressive on your opponent's turn. This deck does appreciate that to some degree, right? Because having ways to stop your opponent's plays, especially after you've already gone through your Crescendo, is nice, and that's why I am opting to include it. Because later on, you can make use out of this very well if the game does go late. The problem is that this card doesn't necessarily help you early on when you're valuing Crescendo a lot more often. And so a lot of the time, if say maybe you open this, but then your normal summon gets disrupted, this doesn't really help out in those cases, obviously, because it's just sitting dead in your hand. Whereas if you cut this for a copy of Return and just play these two, then it makes it so that when you do get stopped, say on particularly Girsu, or maybe you have a Stranded Wand or Nightmare in your hand, you can kind of help unbrick yourself and then get plays farther than you normally would have. Now, this is something that I still needed to test a bit, and I didn't really get around to doing it that much. So this is something that I would definitely recommend making this adaptation if you really want to take this deck super seriously. Because this is something that I can definitely see as a sort of viable path. Because even though this card might seem a bit redundant at times, it really does help you also to draw into a lot of your trap cards, because it's very, very good cards to draw in this deck. And it does suck when you draw this and you don't have targets, but it's the same thing as when you draw Babel and you get stopped in your normal summon, right? So you kind of just have to live with your choices and determine which one is better, just by which one you value more highly. I do like having the disruption just because I still am somewhat a little bit stuck in that traditional Orcust mindset. But that being said, I realize that is not how this build normally wants to operate. So if I were to play this build a bit moving forward, definitely I would consider playing Return over this. Playing all three of this is also kind of questionable, but definitely should consider swapping these out and then kind of determining which one you think is ultimately better in the long run. For here, I'll put this, the Babel, just because I think that it is what a lot of people would be expecting personally. But again, I'm not saying that this is categorically better. I'm not also saying that a Return is categorically better either. You just kind of have to make that judgment. And I think that there hasn't been enough testing just in general of this build, obviously, because not a lot of people are really on this particular type of list. But if more people wanted to sort of engineer it and make adaptations, then this is one of the first things I would actually take a look at. So that is going to do it for all of the sort of engine cards. Next, we can move on into the non-engine stuff. So first, we can talk about hand traps here. So this is going to be super format specific. So we got Ash as just a catch-all. It's not the strongest, but I do think it got better from last format just because of more control elements in the format, as well as just being able to stop Sanguine, for example. That's really good. It's weaker against Drytron just because a single Ash doesn't tend to stop that deck. And against Virtual World, it can also be hit or miss. But this is a card that allows you to make your other disruptions better because you can save those for more impactful moments. So this card is cuttable if you want to, but I also feel like just in a diverse environment such as DB Ladder, this is still worth playing. Next, we got 3 copies of Skullmeister. So I kind of want to make a bit of a point on this versus Ghost Spell because I didn't get a lot of time to test Ghost Spell specifically in this build, but Bell is something you can also opt for. The cool thing about Bell is that if people are going to shift towards like maybe more graveyard removal in the form of DD Crow, for example, to try and stop Drytron, Bell could be used as a counter to that, in addition to being a strong standalone hand trap. So that is something to think about. But Meister I also really like because it's not once per turn and it allows you to hit like specific cards like very, very nicely. For example, think of like Qinglong Engrave or like the Eldritch Traps Engrave. But that being said, Bell also stops like a lot of the starter cards, so it can stop like, for example, Preparation of Rites or Nadir's Servant. So that's like something else to kind of think about, and is another reason why actually Ash could be cuttable is that a lot of the starter cards actually can be stopped by Ghost Bell too. So you could also toy around with the hand trap lineup and the trap lineup. Those are the most flexible things, and you can obviously tailor that to your specific expected metagame or how the format shifts if you happen to stumble across this video at a later date. But next is going to be the 2 copies of a DD Crow. This is kind of the spot I was flexing between for a while in those episodes if you guys were looking at the builds and were tracking them. So these were Cosmics, and then I like bumped Cosmic down from 3 to 2, and I had Call by the Grave in here. And then like I eventually decided like maybe hand traps are just generally more flexible. So I decided to stick DD Crow in here because I really do like just having removal, because in a grindy sort of deck like this one where if you maybe like Meister, say a Drytron, but don't actually get rid of it, they'll have that Drytron name engraved for next turn. Whereas if you do something like DD Crow it, it gets rid of the resource unless if they go through specific hoops and hurdles to get that resource back. For example, like trying to find access to beta. For like that's a very specific example, but you understand the point, right? Is that like these more permanently get rid of what you're trying to deal with. So you can make even a case for bumping this up to 3. So like between these hand traps and like Ghost Spell, for example, those are like very, very strong cards that I would consider. I wouldn't play Impermanence this format, and the reason is that against Virtual World, there's not a very strong time to imperm them during their combo, right? Because it just doesn't interact with the way the VWs activate in hand. So you're saving the imperm if you're going second specifically and using it as a hand trap for like VFD, but they're almost always going to have Chuche because a lot of players are now understanding that like Lulu, send Chuche, search Kowloon is like one of the better plays, or even sending Qinglong searching Chuche directly is fine. So they'll have Chuche a lot of the time if they're able to make VFD in the first place. So imperm doesn't do anything there. Similarly against Drytron, right? Like a lot of people are pivoting away from simply just Vanity's Ruler. If they're ending on Vanity's Ruler, they're ending on either Dragoon to supplement it, or they're ending on something like Hera the Ultimate Nest with a lot of hand traps, or rather fairies to serve as protection. So it's not really good there. And it's similar to VW in that imperm doesn't interact with the engine cards, so you're gonna be having to use it a lot later. Like maybe you can stop like Union Carrier for Dawn Knight, but by then they've already gotten like a myriad of Ben 10 searches, so it's hardly going to actually stop their turn. Whereas like these can stop them much earlier. And then against Eldritch, well, Imperm does basically nothing. So I really would advise against Imperm, and even against like some of the other decks that are still lurking around this format, things like a Dinosaur, they have Misk still, right? So I think it's really hard to make a case for Imperm unless if you're expecting a really, really varied format, in which case go for it. But I think specifically in this format, Imperm has fallen off quite a lot, and there's a good reason for that. We saw basically none of it in the LCS, and I didn't necessarily see all the Remote Duel Extravaganza lists, but just in general, I've noticed a significant drop-off in Imperm as a card in general, so I wouldn't advise playing it. The next is going to be just the traps. So first off, we got probably one of the better traps, which is Ice Dragon's Prison. I've actually gotten a couple comments questioning this card, and I'd be happy to kind of talk about it here. So this card is potentially a high impact card, but at worst, it is a flexible card, right? So this card is not only removal, but it's also Graveyard Disruption, which, as we already established with the way the hand traps are shaping up this format, Graveyard Disruption is paramount. And so even if you're not able to interact a lot with your opponent's board and make like the best trade in terms of removing their threat from their field, still removing stuff from their graveyard is really impactful. Versus Eldritch, this card has always been really strong, and Eldritch is pretty much everywhere. Against Virtual World, you have to be savvy with this card. It really depends on when your opponent decides to utilize things like a Nian Nian, or if you can anticipate like what Lao Lao is trying to get, you can stop them there. Obviously, it's weaker against Lao Lao since they choose in Resolution. But this card does have applications, just because a lot of the more powerful cards are specifically Wind Psychics. The attribute doesn't matter, but the fact that like Lulu and Lalo and Nian are all Psychics makes it that this card allows you to go after the more high impact cards, which is a really, really neat aspect of this. And you can see based on the line that they're taking, like what arrangement and assortment of tuners versus non-tuners they have and what levels they currently have in the field. If they have Chu Chain Grave trying to like level modulate, their plays often can be telegraphed to some degree. So if you're experienced against that matchup, you can use Ice Dragon's Prism very timely and stop them very well in their combo. And then against Drytron, that's where like this card is the most contentious and probably has the least utility, because of course the Drytrons cannot be summoned except by Drytron effects. So you can't steal this and then remove a Drytron from both the grave and the field, which would be nice. But this still does have some applications. For example, they do use Union Carrier, and the Union Carrier also happens to be a machine, which is why the play with Meteonis works. So you can use this and kind of get rid of a Drytron that way, even though it's not the best play because, again, it's a little bit late, kind of falling into the line of Imperm. So that's maybe not the best way to use it. Another way you could think about using it, though, is like against, like maybe if you have a way to stop like Cyber Angel Benten from coming back if they like properly summon it, you can get rid of that. You also, if they go for like a Natasha play, I think this is like probably the best way to use it. If they go for Natasha, they have to obviously properly summon her first before they can use her graveyard effect to start snatch stealing all of your monsters. So if you can steal their Natasha and banish something like a Manju from their field, that's like one way to really get a lot of value. Or you can just summon it to your field and have it sit there so your opponent is forced to clear it by some other means before just utilizing it again. So they're kind of forced to commit more resources that they wouldn't have wanted to. So even though against Drytron it's not the best, there still are applications for it, and I would definitely recommend still playing it. And again, against things like Zoo and Dino, this card is still very, very strong. So next is going to be 3 copies of Solemn Strike. So this card is just a generic catch-all. I don't think it's going to be game-winning by itself a lot of the time, but it is one of the cards that you can really save and punish your opponents if they overextend. And that's like a really, really nice thing to have. It's also flexible going first or going second. It can help insulate your plays while also stopping your opponents. It just has a lot of flexibility, and I think it's one of the cards that I don't conceivably see myself cutting anytime in the near future. The final card in this list is 3 copies of Torrential Tribute. This one is debatable, I'll admit. This one is another high impact card that is great going first or going second, and it's best when paired with like one of these other traps, particularly Strike, because you can help kind of clear boards while forcing certain negations at the same time, which is cool. This is another card that, like I mentioned with Strike, helps punish overextension. The reason why it's not as powerful is that it's not as applicable in certain matchups. You can think of stuff like Eldritch, for example, where it's going to be punishing you more than it's going to be punishing them. And additionally, when you have your board set up, this card becomes a bit more dead due to the fact that either you have to waste your gears to protect it, or you'll just have to let your board die, which isn't that bad because, again, you're expecting a lot of the times your board to sort of get cleared to some extent so you can kind of just start your engine again. So it's not too different clearing the board yourself versus what your opponent is likely going to be able to do, but your opponent not having to commit resources to clear your own board and you doing it yourself can be a hindrance. That being said, though, this is a card that you would definitely want to use as late as possible, as is intuitive. So I think it's still easy enough to sort of play around the optimal timing of this. You could swap this out for other cards in the format, but I think that if you're not playing hand traps, you want your cards to have high impact, which is why I opted for this over something like, say, Book of Moon, I guess. Even though Book of Moon has also kind of fallen off in popularity, but like these cards all can be devastating, and to some extent they can be turn enders as well. So that's why I figured that these cards are some of the best ones to play, and I really enjoy having those in my lineup. So that is it for the main deck. Next, we're going to go ahead and talk about the extra deck for a bit here. I've kind of talked a lot here, so we'll just go ahead and kind of breeze through this extra deck, which doesn't actually have too much to explain. So first, we have 3 copies of Galatea, 2 Dingirsu, and 1 Longirsu. This is a pretty staple, standard Orcust engine, if you will. You want 3 Galatea because it can come up where you're grinding a lot. It hasn't come up specifically for me yet, but just in theory, this is a card that can come up because of the nature of how the deck operates. This is something that you can test around with, just because, again, I haven't really been as extensively testing this necessarily, but just as a concept of this being a control build, you would expect that 3 of this would be the right choice naturally, right? The rest of it is pretty self-explanatory. Next, we got Zeus, actually, which is a cool inclusion. When you go Gala into Ding and then put a Zeus on top, it's really nice, especially when you already went through your other cards. If you're not playing Babel, this becomes even better, just because like you're not ever really going to be getting a lot of value off of Ding on your opponent's turn otherwise. So having a Zeus there is really, really nice. But we all know that Zeus is a very strong card. Next are just some utility cards. So we got Nightmares, Phoenix, and Unicorn. I was playing Cerberus, but then I ended up cutting it. Cerberus actually is quite strong in this format, so I would like to find space for it, but unfortunately I was just not able to in the end. It was actually my initial build, if you guys do remember through the first episode, but ended up cutting it. Next, we have a copy of Linkuriboh because we want to get rid of potentially Brass or the Yusu tokens. The next card is a copy of Barricade Blocker. This card allows you to obviously get your Orcust out of your hand if need be, and you don't have any access to otherwise. Something important to note with this card is that there's still some confusion about if you can use this effect if you don't play a continuous field spell in your deck, which is like a fringe reason to maybe still play Babel if those rulings are unclear of where you're playing. But that's something to always check with the head judge of whatever event you're playing, because as far as I'm aware, there hasn't actually been an official conclusive ruling to this. Even though, like, I feel like this has been gone over quite a lot. But as far as I'm aware, there's no official ruling yet. So, yeah, just keep that in mind. But, generally speaking, this getting Orcust out of your hand is a very, very good thing to have at your disposal. Next is a copy of Masquerena, because I am playing Babel, so this is a bit better in this build. So just having, like, a turn 3 or turn 5 play to go like Masquerena plus Dingirsu is like fine when your opponent already has expended resources to clear your initial push through like Crescendo plus your traps. So that is a pretty nice thing to have access to. Next is a copy of Lib, the World Keyblade Master. This is a card I wasn't initially playing because I actually forgot about it, but this allows you to summon herself once you have a wand engraved and then set a copy of memory, and that is just a lot of advantage to generate. It's awkward because like you can't use quick play spells to turn their set, even though Lib allows you to activate them. Just by game mechanics, you can't activate memory the same turn. But it still is nice to just have a free card that you can spring on your opponent's turn because, again, this is a grindy deck by nature. And the cool thing is that it interacts very nicely with access code because if you chain block the Lib removal effect with access code, they can't respond. So you're able to just shuffle a card away for free, which is cool. And then the final card is Zeroboros. This is a card that is nice to IP into. Works well with Gizmic. You guys all know these standard Orcust shenanigans with this card. So with that, I will hit sort and then move on to the side deck, which always is very tentative and based on specific metagame trends. And this is like the part of the deck that should be changing, I would say, the most frequently, in addition to the just general traps in this deck, right? So first up, we got 3 copies of Artifact Lancia. This is good for Virtual World. I don't typically tend to side against Eldritch just because that matchup tends to grind on for so long. Against Virtual World, you want to stop the turn 1 because playing against VFD, while this deck can do it because you have traps to sit on, is still not great to do when you're trying to set up a stronger board to play past whatever your opponent is doing. So having this there is nice. Same deal with Dino, right? You don't want to deal with Dolka UCT, so you would rather just stop that entirely. So against kind of must stop decks, this is better to put in against, whereas if you're going to be grinding already against Eldritch, then one extra turn, you could argue it's kind of a similar concept with Skullmeister and DD Crow, but Meister allows you to just kind of it lets you sort of pick when you want to utilize it, right? You have a lot more flexibility in that regard, and it's like more useful at later stages in the game. If you need to stop like a specific grave effect, like maybe a Lord and grave effect, for example. So this has like just different applications, similar with Crow. And then we have 3 copies of Nibiru. This card is cuttable for sure. Really, there aren't too many decks that get hindered by Nibiru anymore. So this is a card that I could maybe see myself cutting. But again, just definitely look out for what the metagame looks like. This might be completely different in 1 or 2 months' time. So just keep that in the back of your minds if you're watching this later. Next is 3 copies of Cosmic. You know, gotta be Eldritch, gotta be potential Floodgates. This card's just really, really strong all around this format. Definitely main deck worthy as well if you wanted to do that. So if you want to go that route, by all means, go right ahead. Next is Call by the Grave. This card is also interesting. You could argue to main deck this card because it's good against Drytron, stopping Bentem, or even any of the Drytron names, but stopping Benten. It's good against Eldritch because stopping Lord and Grave is nice. And this card can help against hand traps, especially the ones that stop your deck, even though like you're playing the ones that also would stop your deck, so it kind of can shut those off too. But it's nice to have like extra insurance in those cases, and it's just a strong natural defensive card in control formats as well, hand traps aside. Next is a copy of Harpy's Feather Duster, if I can spell it correctly. There we go. So this is obviously just general back removal. Same deal with Pankratops, good generic go second card. We're not playing Reboot because our deck is not an OTK deck, so we are not trying to do that. But in terms of more back removal, we are playing 3 copies of Heavy Storm Duster. So this allows you to actually just make favorable trades in control matchups. It is just natively a +1, so you can really use this to your advantage. Things like maybe Zoo, which is still somewhat running around, you can utilize this against, and just any deck that plays like a lot of like generic defensive traps. You want to hit their Ice Dragon's Prisons, you want to hit their strikes, things like that. So that is why this is in here. And that is going to do it for this deck profile. So I want to thank you all for watching. If you have made it this far and want to see more of this deck, I will be willing to do another week worth of Road to 1000 Duel Week rating episodes, followed by maybe a primer on the next Saturday. Maybe I can show off some like test hands and then talk a little bit more about like specific matchups, things to keep in mind. If you guys are interested in that kind of thing, let me know. If you guys leave 200 likes in this video within 24 hours of this deck profile coming out, so by Sunday noon EST, I will shift gears and keep playing this deck for Road to 1000. But otherwise, I'll probably be moving on to something else at this point. But this is going to be the general structure of that series. So if you guys do enjoy that, definitely let me know. Feedback is always welcome. But that's going to do it for the video, guys. Thank you so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. If you did, be sure to leave a like as well as any thoughts or feedback in the comments. Subscribe for more informative and competitive Yu-Gi-Oh content. If you want to, you can follow me on all social media platforms or support me via Patreon or TCG Player. All the links in the description as usual. And until next time, I'll catch you in the next video. See you guys.